Good morning on this cold morning, and welcome to session 2 of Celtic mythology. Last week, I told you a bit about Nancy's background. Today, I'll mention what led to her interest in the study of mythology. Growing up in a family that loved to tell stories, some of them even true, moving constantly as a child and adult, developing a love of languages, growing in awareness of the power of words to create and destroy, all led to her to do a PhD in Celtic mythology. She loves to tell stories to anyone who will listen. Today's topic is the cult of the warrior hero. I won't begin to try to pronounce the name of the hero. So, Nancy. Oh, okay, very good.
Well, I will just, is this one on? It's on. Is it working? Can you? This one sounded better. Thank you. Is that better? Is that better? I'm having a little trouble getting used to sound. I got, excuse me, new hearing aids yesterday, and everything is so loud. So if I start dropping my volume, wave a hand or something. Yeah, let's see. Okay, this is just a beauty spot of Ireland because why not? I wanted, okay, just to follow up on what Julianne or what Sheila said, the warrior hero we're going to be looking at today is called Cuchulainn. When you see the spelling, you'll say, huh? But I want to follow up on a couple of questions from last week's class. Someone asked about the relationship between the Celts and the Scythians. The two groups came from the same melting pot on the steppes of central Russia. They were warriors and horsemen, but the Scythians rode horses into battle while the Celts developed the war chariot. The Scythians were nomadic, and the Celts settled down in particular territories that they defended fiercely. Both groups were known for their ferocity in battle, but the Celts had an instrument, and you can see a picture of it in the back of this, standing up high like that. Now, how do I? All I need to do is poke the button, but I can't reach it from here. So the Celts had an incredible instrument called the carnix, and they carried it into battle and played it, and it struck terror in the hearts of their enemies. If this close-up of the head, you see the red tongue. Yep. Wrong, sorry. Sorry. My fingers are cold. You can see the red tongue sticking out there, and that waggled when the instrument was played. And I'm hoping we'll get to hear it. If not, we will move on. This is a reconstructed carnix. For those of you who are musicians, And this is a picture of a cauldron, part of a cauldron. And all the way over on the far right, you can see images of the Karnaks being carried into battle. This is a very enigmatic Celtic image. Many people have tried to decipher what's going on. On the far left is obviously a deity who is dumping someone headfirst into a cauldron. Now, there are stories of cauldrons that could bring dead warriors back to life, but there are also stories of people, enemies, being drowned in a cauldron. So take your pick. You want to be optimistic or negative, and the horsemen up on the top and the foot soldiers down in the bottom. Their artwork, this is Celtic and this is Scythian, bears a real resemblance, but we're much more familiar with the Celtic because that's in museums spread throughout Europe, where most of the Scythian artwork is in the Hermitage in Russia. Now, the Celts settled in territories which they defended fiercely. The Scythians were nomadic. And the Scythians were not blessed or cursed with having been converted by the Christian church. So they had no one to take down their stories as the Celts did. And that upper one is Celtic art, the lower left is Scythian. They both wore the same sorts of things. And this is what happened with Celtic art in the Christian era, used to decorate manuscripts. You can see the fierce beast wrapping around. Now, this is a map of the territory. The one on the, it is this same, the green one is the Celtic territory, and the red one is the Scythians. And the area just over the key in the right-hand map is the area just to the right of Greece, which shows up more easily in the Celtic map.
That was made by accident, sorry.
Okay. That was just changing gears here. The other remark from last week that I'm going to follow up on, and I think that wasn't just moving gears, was the similarity between the Celtic otherworld and modern tales like Brigadoon, where a world suddenly appears out of a mist and it's there for a day and then it's gone. Obviously, a direct heritage from the Celts. Now, in the Celtic world, as in our world today, things always happen in threes. This is a legacy from the Celts. Other civilizations have other sacred numbers. For the Babylonians, it was 12. For the Hopi, it's 4. For other groups, it's 7. But for the Celts and for us, it's 3. Things always happen in 3, morning, noon, night. I'm not going to read this because I know you can. But I think one of the reasons that Christianity was so successful with the Celts was that the idea of the Trinity appealed to them. It was a 3-part God, and many of the Celtic deities happened in 3s. And it was after the first Christian monks hit Ireland that the Trinity became a really important part of the Christian church. before that, it had been an idea that was discussed and argued about. Okay, now I know that I promised in the syllabus that I would introduce you to the Celtic gods today. And I hate to renege on a promise, but when I started looking at the 300 plus named Celtic deities, many of them local to a particular place, I just threw my hands up in the air and said, I can't even begin to deal with that in 2 or even 3 class sessions. And really, there's nothing quite so boring as giving you a name. This was the god of vegetation, blah, blah, boom, move on to the next name. So I'm going to try to show you some of the images that tell us a bit about the Celtic worship without getting into named deities. This is an image from the south of France, the Celtic area of France, of a beast called the Tarasque. And you can probably see, I hope, that he has his 2 front paws on severed heads. And out of his mouth, in the side view, you see him chewing on a human arm. The Celtic deities were not portrayed as gorgeous anthropomorphic figures like the Greeks and Romans. Instead, they emphasized what they saw as important. And I know you met these 3 heads last week, but I wanted to bring them back because I think they tell us more about the Celtic world than giving you names. Although I will tell you that the gold guy in the center is called the Dagda, the good god. Not because he was particularly good in any moral sense. He was a warrior, he was a poet, he was just good at doing stuff. He was a fabulous warrior. Now, this sort of appears to be rough stonework. This is another head that I'm particularly fond of, and you can see the famous Celtic mustaches, which scandalized the classical world. This sort of rough stonework was done by the same people and roughly at the same time as the people who did this beautiful gold work. So it wasn't a question of them not being able to turn out the polished figures that the classical world did, but they showed what was important to them as the deities. And many of the Celtic deities are shapeshifters. You all familiar with shapeshifters? Anybody? So the war goddess, for example, can appear as a beautiful young woman, an ugly old crone hunched over, a raven, a crow, and sometimes she can change shape while she's appearing to a mortal. We wish we knew more about the worship of the deities, about their iconography, but we don't, because the Druids kept that information secret, believing it was too important to be written down for just any old person to see. So today we're going to meet a few of the deities, but we're going to meet them as they appear in something called the Remskala, the tales leading up to the great cattle raid of Cooley, a tale as central to Irish myth as the Iliad or the Odyssey is to the Greeks. Each of these stories reveals a slightly different aspect of Celtic myth, and many, if not most of them, will introduce you to one or more of the Celtic deities. These stories all have to do with the cycle of life: conception, birth, death, and lineage. This slide that's sitting up there is a graphic image of the continuity of things in the Irish world. Springs were sacred to the goddess of fertility, or goddesses, I should say, and women back into prehistoric times, particularly women, but sometimes men, would go to the springs, invoke the goddess, and then tie a piece of cloth from their clothing around a branch, leaving it as an offering and an invocation to bring them a child, to bring them their lover back, whatever it was they wanted. Okay, we're going to be talking, oh, this doesn't show up very well. We're going to be talking today also about the battles between the Ulstermen, the Ulaid, who came from the Red Province up in the far north, and the men of Connacht, the blue area to the left. And the rest of this just kind of gets ignored in these stories. Conover MacNessa, son of Ness, the king of Ulster, rules from his fort in Ulster. He's often said to be the son of the High King, although in some of the stories, like the one you'll hear today, his father is the Druid, Catha. It's not at all unusual for someone to have more than one father and occasionally more than one mother. Furthermore, he's usually known by his matronymic, that is named for his mother rather than his father. He's known as MacNessa. Ness was the daughter of the King of Ulster, and we'll hear more about Ness in a few minutes. His home, Ewen Macha, is still occupied today. It's called Nevin Fort, near the present-day city of Armagh. So it's an area that's been inhabited for a good long time. The men of Ulster are most often in conflict with the people of Connacht. And this is the Blue Province, led by their queen Maeve and her husband Ailill. And I think you met those last week. Their ally Fergus MacRoich, a former king of the Ulstermen who's in exile. And you'll hear a story today about why he wound up in exile. The longest and most important story of the cycle is the Táin Bó Cúailnge, in which Maeve raises an enormous army to invade the Cooley Peninsula and steal the prize bull, where he is opposed by only the 17-year-old Cuchulainn. You wonder what happened to the rest of the warriors? Well, I'm going to tell you in just a minute. Now, you can imagine in an oral society, one of the worst things that can happen is to lose a story. There we go. In an oral society, stories are transferred from one person's head to another. We are such a people of the book that it's hard to imagine not having any copy of a story, even on Google, to rely on. Our minds have not been trained to remember things. We make grocery lists and then we forget where we've placed them. So when you think about stories being transferred from one person's head to the next, you need to be careful to tell your story to someone who's going to remember it. Think about recent years when whole families were wiped out during the Holocaust. The family's stories were lost as well. So the first story I'm going to tell you today concerns the loss of a very important story, the cattle raid of Cooley, or to give it its Irish name, the Toin Cooley. As we go through this morning, I'm going to give you the names of the stories and some of the major players. So if you see a name that's not up there, it's not that important. If you hear a name. Once, all the poets of Ireland were gathered at the home of Gwari with their wives and their servants, and they were eating poor Gwari out of house and home. It was a matter of honor to feed anyone who came to visit you. And if they stayed, you still had to feed them. Gwari's brother finally decided he had to do something, and he placed a curse on them, all the visitors, that they would lose their gift of prophecy if they couldn't recite the whole of the Toin. They gathered and they talked for hours, but between them, the poets could only remember bits and pieces of the entire story. So the poets all went out roaming the countryside to find someone who knew the entire story. Then one night, a young poet named Muirgan came upon the grave of a famous warrior, at that point long dead, named Fergus MacRoich. A mist rose. Night was coming on. Muirgan was in despair. He wanted so desperately to be the one who found the entire poem and save everyone's gift of prophecy, most especially his own. Standing by Fergus's grave, Muirgan chanted, "Oh, Fergus, if only this rock were your own true self, then poets, looking for a roof to cover them here, would recover the Toin, plain and perfect, Fergus." The mist thickened, and suddenly out of it came striding the ghost of Fergus MacRoich in great majesty, wearing a green cloak, a dazzling red tunic, and a golden sword. For 3 days and 3 nights, Fergus recited the entire Toin from start to finish. Then he disappeared. Muirgan returned to the others to narrate the story, lift the curse, and so the Toin was recovered for all to hear. And as soon as the Christian scribes showed up, they said, "Hey, write this down, it's important." I told you many of these stories would be about births. This is the conception of Conover. And I know it looks like it should be Conco Bar, but it's Conover. We're going to step back in time for this one because Fergus MacRoich, that you just met dead as a ghost, is the one still very much alive. The story, or at least part of the story, begins with a young woman named Ness. Yes, this is the same Ness I mentioned above, the daughter of the King of Ulster. Now, one day, she was sitting outside the fort when the druid, Catha, and it looks like it should be Cathbad, but it's Catha, passed by. Since every day was good for something, and only druids knew what that something was, Ness cried out, "Catha, what is this day good for?" Catha thought for a minute and then replied, "It's a perfect day for conceiving a king on a queen." "Are you saying truth?" she demanded. "Indeed I am," he replied. "I swear by all the gods." Ness looked around, and the only man she could see was Katha, so she took him to her bedroom and lay with him so that she would become pregnant. And just as she hoped, she conceived a child. 3 months and 3 years later, she gave birth to a boy she named Conover. She spent 7 years teaching the child everything he needed to know, including the love of power. Now, Ness was beautiful and sought after by Fergus MacRoich. He pleaded with her to marry him. She said, "Certainly, I only ask one thing, and that is that you name my son king for a year, so that someday his own sons may be called the sons of kings." He said, "Oh, yes, anything you want." And these are some of the most dangerous words a man or a woman in love can ever utter. She continued, "You'll still rule over Ulster, my dear Fergus, in all but name." Fergus agreed, and Ness set about gaining the kingship for her son permanently. They gave generous gifts, and when the year of the kingship was up and Fergus went back to his warriors to take back the crown from Conover, the warriors weren't pleased that he'd used the kingship as a dowry, and they were also grateful for all the gifts they'd gotten. They said, "Let what Fergus sold stay sold." And they made Conover their king. Conover was loved by all the people of Ulster. His judgment was good. The land was fruitful and prosperous. He was the bravest of all the Ulster warriors. His generosity was legendary, and his feasting hall was always full of guests, dining from the bounty of his table. He seemed, in every way, the perfect king. Now, by now, you know that that's not where the story ends. No human ruler is perfect. The next story is a prime example of events that appear to be taking place exclusively in the human realm. But things aren't always what they seem. There was a wealthy but lonely widower who lived with his sons in the mountains of Ulster. One day, when he was alone at the farm, a beautiful woman came walking down from the hills, walked through his yard, walked into the house, and went to work, doing all the household chores as if she'd lived there for years. That night, she climbed into Cruniac's bed and made love with him. The woman stayed with Cruniac after that and took care of him and his sons. While she was there, the farm prospered. There was never a lack of food, clothing, or anything they needed. One day, while she was living there, Conover called all the people of Ulster to a great festival at his fort. Everyone gathered wearing their best clothes. Even Cruniac and his sons came. But his wife stayed behind because she was 9 months pregnant. At the end of the feasting and celebration, there was a great horse race on a nearby field. Conover and all the warriors brought their horses, but the king's team always won. Conover was pleased to hear everyone say, No one can beat the king's horses. Suddenly, Crignac, not the brightest bulb, spoke up. My wife can run even faster than the king's horses, he boasted. The king's men dragged him to Conover, who was furious at the claim and demanded that Crignac prove that his boast was true. So the king sent a messenger to the farm to fetch the woman. When he showed up, she pleaded with him. Please, she said, I can't race now. I'm pregnant with twins, and I'm going to give birth any day. But the messengers wouldn't listen. They said, if you don't come, your husband will be killed. And so the woman went. Her labor pains arrived just as she came to the fort. She begged the king not to make her run, but he refused to listen. She turned to the crowd gathered there, the warriors and the women, and pleaded with them, please, please help me. A mother bore each of you. At least wait until my children are born before you force me to race. But everyone gathered there ignored her pleas. So the race began. Macha flew around the field like the fastest of horses. She stayed right beside the king's chariot until she put on a sudden burst and crossed the finish line just ahead of his team. She fell to the ground at the end of the race and gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. In her labor pains, Macha screamed at the king and his warriors that from that time forward, in the hour of their greatest need, the warriors would suffer the same pains that she had suffered. And these pains would last for 5 days and 4 nights. Her curse would hold for 9 generations. And whenever danger came to Ulster, all the men would collapse in labor pains, unable to move in their agony. Only women, young boys, and the great warrior Cuchulainn were spared from the terrible curse of Macha. Now you've gathered by now that Macha is a goddess. And this is one of the problems with the sorry about that, Celtic deities. Macha is part of a trinity of deities, war goddesses. She is also called Epona, and in that guise, she is a horse goddess who was adopted by the Roman cavalry. The other 3, well, the other 2 are also known by a variety of names. The Morrigan, whose name survives in Arthurian legend as Morgan le Fay. The other names are Crow or Raven, Bav. As Raven, the war goddess can appear in the field of battle and turn the tide in favor of those who respect her. So you don't want to mess, don't mess with pregnant women. And there's, as many parts of Ireland, these are called the Pops of Maeve. Now the next story, running low on time, is called The Exile of the Sons of Ishlu. don't know, does anybody need a moment to just breathe and think about poor Maka lying there on the ground? Somebody must have picked up the twins. And anyway, one day, Conover and the warriors of Ulster were gathered for a feast at the home of the king's chief storyteller, Fedlimid. His wife was serving them, more pregnant women coming, even though she was just about ready to give birth. Meat was set before the warriors on overflowing platters. Drink horns full of wine were passed around the hall until drunken shouting and laughter filled the night. At the end of the evening, when the men had all fallen asleep or passed out, Fedlimid's wife at last crossed the hall to her own bedchamber. Suddenly, the child in her womb gave out a tremendous scream, so loud and so terrifying, it woke everyone in the house. The warriors jumped to their feet, believing that the fort was under attack, but Sancho MacAlil, the chief judge, ordered everyone to be quiet and the woman to be brought before them. Her husband asked her, "What was that fearful cry that came out of your womb?" The woman shook her head in bewilderment. "Even though the cry came from my own womb, the cradle of my own body, no woman knows what her own womb bears." She turned to the druid Catha, hoping that he might explain the cry. "Gentle Catha," she pleaded, "tell me what you know." He replied, "From the hollow of your womb, there cried a woman with twisted yellow hair and beautiful gray-green eyes. Her cheeks are flushed like foxglove, and her teeth are lustrous like Parthian red. Queens will envy her. Heroes will fight for her. Kings will seek her for their bed. Because of her, great will be the slaughter among the chariot warriors of Ulster." Catha placed his hand on the woman's belly, and the child moved at his touch. "Yes," he said, "this is a girl. Deirdre is her name, and she will bring evil on us all." No one forgot the Druid's prophecy, and when the child was born, she was indeed the most beautiful child they'd ever seen anywhere. But the Ulstermen all shouted, "Kill her! Kill her!" "No," said Conover. "I will take her away and have her raised away from all jealous eyes. When she's old enough, I'll bring her to my bed." Not such a good king after all. And Deirdre was spirited off, given to be fostered in a secret location. The only people who ever saw her were her foster father and mother, along with a poet satirist named Levercham. Oh, I didn't put her name on, who could not be kept away because people feared satirists. Their words could bring evil. One day, when Deirdre had grown into a beautiful young woman, her foster father was outside skinning a calf in the snow. A raven settled on the snow next to the pool of blood and started drinking the blood. Deirdre said, "I could love a man with these three colors: hair black as a raven, cheeks red like blood, and a body white as snow. Levercham, who was standing nearby, said, "Luck and fortune are with you, my dear, for such a man is not far away. Neusha, son of Ishlu. I will be ill until I see him," Deirdre declared. Soon after, Neusha was standing guard on the ramparts of Evwen Makkah and singing. The songs of the sons of Ishlu were so sweet that everyone who heard them was filled with peace, and every cow who heard them gave 2/3 more milk. The sons were also great warriors. If they stood back to back, no one in the world could hold them off. They were moreover as swift as hunting hounds and could outrun wild beasts. Talk about perfect. Neusha was on the walls alone, and Deirdre slipped away from her hidden farm and came near, as if she were merely walking by. He didn't recognize her at first. "That's a fine heifer going by," he said, the early Irish equivalent of a wolf whistle. "The heifers are bound to be fine when there are no bulls around," she replied. Then he suddenly realized who she was. "You have the greatest bull of the entire province to yourself, the King of Ulster." "Between you and him," she said, "I'd choose a fine young bull like you." "Don't say such things," Neusha cried, remembering Katha's prophecy. "Are you rejecting me?" she said. "Yes, I must." Then Deirdre seized him by both ears. "2 ears of shame and mockery these will be if you don't take me away with you." "No," he cried, "get away from me, woman." "You will do it," she cursed him. And now Neusha is in the same catch-22 we've seen before. He can't take the king's woman, but he can't refuse her binding demand. A cry arose from Neusha's throat. As it grew in volume and despondency and despair, the men of Ulster heard it and began to take up arms. But the brothers of Neusha knew what it was and ran to quiet him. "What are you doing?" they asked. "The Ulstermen will come to blows because of you." So Neusha told them what had happened. "Evil will come from this," they said, "but you will not be disgraced while we are alive. We'll leave here and go some other place. No king in Ireland will deny us welcome." And so they left that night with 3 times 50 warriors, 3 times 50 women, and the same number of hounds and servants, a big group. They traveled across Ireland searching for a safe place to settle, but everywhere they went, Conover had laid a trap for them. At last, they crossed the sea to Britain, where they lived in the mountains and hunted wild animals. One day, a servant of the local king happened to enter the home that they'd built for Deirdre and Neusha. He saw them sleeping. He ran straight to the king and said, "I found the most beautiful woman in the world for you. All you have to do is kill Neusha, and she'd be yours." Well, the king was reluctant to just kill somebody for no reason. So he sent the sons of Ishlu off on increasingly dangerous war missions for him, hoping that somebody else would kill him, but nobody did. Finally, one day, Deirdre heard one of the king's servants say, "The king's just going to have to kill Neusha." So Deirdre told Neusha what the king's servant had said, and at last Deirdre persuaded Neusha that they should return back to Ireland. When Conover's warriors heard that Neusha was back, they told the king it was time to forgive him. Years have passed. She might even be ugly by now, they said to the king. But Conover sent them a message guaranteeing their safety. Neusha and her brothers agreed, as long as the previous king Fergus, the great warrior Dubthach, and his own son, the king's own son, Cormac, would pledge themselves as guarantors of Cormac's goodwill. Fergus and the others went down to the sea to meet Neusha. But Conover had other plans. He knew that Fergus was bound by a gaish, prohibition. He could never pass a feast without joining it. So the king held banquets all along the way to slow Fergus down. Neusha and his brothers had sworn an oath that they wouldn't eat until they had their feet under Conover's table. Finally, when the sons of Ishlu came to Conover's fortress at Ebwen Macha, along with Fergus's son, Fiacha, the whole of Ulster was waiting for them with their weapons ready. Eogan MacDurthack was the first to greet Neusha, not with words, but with the thrust of a spear through his chest that came out his back and broke his spine. Fergus threw himself across Neusha to protect him, but it was too late. The returning band of men with Deirdre had expected a welcome, not an attack, so they were not prepared. The Ulster warriors slaughtered the brothers of Neusha and all of his followers until the grass ran red with their blood. Deirdre alone was left alive. Her hands bound behind her back, she was taken to Conover. Fergus, when he heard of this, gathered his troops, his honor now tarnished completely, and fled to the west to the kingdom of Alil and Maeve, where they were welcomed as exiles. For 16 years, they lived there, lamenting their betrayal and the loss of their honor. As for Deirdre, she was taken captive. She never again smiled. She never again raised her head to look at anyone. She mourned the loss of Neusha, lamenting without ceasing, until one day, in desperation and fury, Conover asked Deirdre, "Who in the entire world do you hate the most?" "You," she said. "You and Eogan MacDermot, the man who killed Neusha." So Conover decided to give her to Eogan. The morning that Eogan took her from Ebwen Macha, she stood between him and Conover in his chariot as they left the gate. "Deirdre," laughed Conover, "don't look so downcast. Between me and Eogan, you are powerless as a sheep between two rams." Just then, they came around a bend, and Deirdre saw a large boulder in the road in front of them. She threw herself out of the chariot head first, smashed her head into the boulder, and lay dead in the road, depriving both men of their prize forever. Now, if you remember back to the very beginning of the story, when Deirdre screamed in her mother's womb and Katha prophesied that she'd be beautiful, coveted by many men, and the cause of great bloodshed. This is what came to pass. Now, could the Druid really see all this happening? Or did his prophecy cause it to happen? This is a question that arises in many of the Celtic tales, where we see the power of the word operating. One place to bind Fergus to keep him from fulfilling his duty to Neusha, a vow of Neusha to not eat anywhere until he was seated at Katha's table, sent him, Deirdre, and all his men into the slaughter awaiting them at Ebwen Macha. So Fergus and the exiles of Ulster went to live in Connacht with the enemies of their people. These stories and others are collectively called Remskala, and they are the pre-tales or the stories leading up to the great cattle raid. They serve to establish the fact that the Táin action is not only the result of humans acting in the world, but otherworld deities involved in the affairs of humans. Now, I had a fabulous story. I have a fabulous story, but I don't have time to tell you today. It's the birth of Cuchulainn, the quintessential Celtic warrior. And if you're up for it, we'll save it for next week. And you can see a triple birth and other adventures. Questions?
Nancy, great stories, and you're a great storyteller. And I
Thank you.
think this was a wonderful example of the power of stories. Really wonderful. Am I wrong that there were 3 stories? Was that an accident?
Well, actually, there were supposed to be 4, but I don't think it was an accident that there were only 3.
Okay, we're ready for questions. Anybody got questions? Otherwise, we can breathlessly wait for next week's installment in the next story. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you all for coming. If you find a Carnax, I think it would be a wonderful thing to have here in the Oak Room.